Tim Burton's quirky 1990 film Edward Scissorhands is a classic. The character of Edward is iconic alongside Burton's other creations such as Jack Skellington and Emily from The Corpse Bride. Like all of Burton's memorable creations, Edward represents the lonely but lovable outsider in all of us. True to Burton's aesthetic, the figure of Edward is dark, spindly, and sorrowful. More importantly, he's great for cosplaying. I'm sorry to say that while I generally enjoy Tim Burton's work, Edward Scissorhands is not one of my favorite films. The only reason I watched it as much as I did is because my mother loves it. It's one of her favorite films. We had it on VHS and would generally watch it around Christmas time. I was always hesitant to watch, but couldn't articulate why I didn't love the film. I could watch Big Fish, Big Eyes, Beetlejuice, Nightmare Before Christmas, Sleepy Hollow, and Sweeney Todd all day long, but though it pops up constantly on my streaming services, I always swipe right past Edward Scissorhands like it's some yucky leftovers in the fridge. But recently, I decided to confront the film when it popped up again on Disney+. As I watched, I asked myself what, if anything, freaked me out in each scene. The opening is lovely and Christmassy, not scary. Peg going around selling Avon is decidedly subdued. There's some freaky haunted house imagery in the mansion, but it's really pretty tame. Edward himself looks like he always does, totally fine after the initial shock of the scissors. There are plenty of scenes that are cringe, but what fish out of water film doesn't have those? And though they feel uncomfortable, they're about as scary as an episode of The Office. The one scene I absolutely can't stand is in the salon, which goes beyond cringe and into new, much more awful territory. This is the scene when Joyce attempts to seduce/rape Edward. It's terrible and I hate it so much. It's a bizarre scene that pollutes the film. I'm not against sex scenes in general, they're honestly fine if they're part of the story, but I don't understand what this scene adds to the film. Later it's revealed that Joyce told her friends that Edward assaulted her. I think maybe this scene, along with Jim's plot to use Edward to help him rob his parents, was to show how dishonest people could take advantage of an outsider's naivety. This leads to Edward being shunned by the wider community, who had initially been curious and welcoming toward him. These two alleged crimes turn them against him, but these alleged crimes are not treated with equal gravity. When Edward is arrested, it truly has a ripple effect throughout both the Boggs family and their neighborhood. But when I say that the salon scene has no effect on the rest of the film, I mean it is never addressed except for one tiny throwaway line near the end of the film.
He practically raped Joyce, you know.
That's it. That's all anyone says, and no one responds. She seems conflicted in the very final scene, but I don't feel like it resolves this subplot. But was this one plot point the whole reason the film made me uneasy? It's just such a small part of it. I started to worry that there may be something wrong with me for not liking the film. People seem to universally love this film, and I've not heard any criticisms of it. But I have to admit that it's actually very good in a lot of ways. Its production design and costumes are unforgettable. Makeup design by the legendary Stan Winston is flawless. The dialogue feels natural and the acting is terrific. The framing device of a literal bedtime story is great for setting up the fairy tale/fantasy tone of the film. It has all the childlike innocence of a Rankin Bass stop-motion special. Story-wise, there is a clear protagonist and antagonist. The main character is a misunderstood, lonely Frankenstein's monster-like man with a heart of gold, who defeats an evil bully. Some people object to this plot point, saying it changes the tone of the film for the worse, but I disagree. I believe the entire story was leading to it. I think it takes it successfully out of straight fantasy, darkens it, and dips its toe into revenge horror territory. And to be fair, the last scene is the only instance of true violence in the whole film and feels well earned. It answers the question of what gentle Edward would do with his blades if his life were threatened. I am not 100% certain of the reason of the film gave me the creeps, but I think I'm getting closer. And I think it has to do with the film's treatment of sexuality and Edward's relationship with women. When I say Edward's relationship with women made me uncomfortable, I don't mean to say women are misused or abused in any way. Quite the opposite. There are more female characters than male. They have most of the dialogue and their actions largely drive the plot. You could almost say that women dominate the film. Overall, the film has a feminine, almost dainty quality. This makes Jim's brutality seem especially out of place. While Jim may be the most obvious villain, there are female aggressors as well in the form of Joyce and Esmeralda. As a kid, Esmeralda scared me a lot. She's the most hostile character for most of the film, but as an adult, I barely even notice her, and she turns out to be harmless. What bothers me is how little work Edward does to change his situation. His whole journey is shaped and led by women. Lately, we talk a lot about emotional labor and how it is usually taken on by women. That is exactly the case with Edward Scissorhands. Edward only emerges from his castle because Peg decides to take him home like a lost puppy.
I think you should just come home with me.
He only meets the neighbors when the neighbor ladies insist on congregating at Peg's for a barbecue. It's true that he does begin creating fantastical topiaries and dog haircuts of his own accord, but it's Joyce's idea to have him cut her hair. He may be an artist, but he just goes from place to place doing whatever people ask of him, which goes fine until the burglary, which again, he only does because Kim asks him to. He never stands up for himself and just does what other people tell him to do without question, and that creeps me out. I don't like how Edward, after all he's been through by the end of the story, never changes or gains new insights. I realize that the one thing that robs Edward of his true humanity is his total lack of initiative. He doesn't make things happen, things just happen to him. And it doesn't have to be this way. Remember, he's not an android. He has normal emotions. He experiences pain and fear. He values friendships and can keep secrets.
Thank you for not telling them that
I know it was Jim's house.
He has emotional responses such as love and anger, but he makes no effort to carve his own path. He never reaches out to right a wrong or help someone in need. He makes himself useful, but never indispensable. I would have liked to see him solve a dilemma or become an essential part of the community in some way. I still think you could have the same ending, but his departure from the community would have been felt more acutely. I know he saves Kevin, but that whole instance feels like an afterthought. I understand what Burton was trying to say through Edward, that you can be as kind and accommodating as humanly possible, but if you're different, relationships with others will always be a challenge. Worse still, any small misstep, whether or not it's your fault, can cause public opinion of you to switch instantly, especially in a community that is prone to prejudice and gossip. Here's what I finally realized in my most recent viewing of the film. The one person who is not a stock character or stereotype is Kim. She is a dynamic character thrown into a new and frightening situation in which she learns to cope, grow, and thrive. She is the only character with an arc. When she first finds Edward in her bed, she is terrified of him. I mean, who wouldn't be? She has almost no dialogue with Edward and is very slow to warm up to him. Over time, she starts to see how Edward is more than just a weird guy who looks like a black licorice vine. She sees that he is helpful, trustworthy, and artistic. Most importantly, he is docile, in contrast to the selfish, violent Jim. Kim and Jim's toxic relationship dynamic escalates until Kim reveals that she doesn't love him. She is the closest thing the film has to a hero. Yes, you heard me correctly. It is she who strikes Jim and threatens to kill him in order to protect Edward. Edward then kills Jim in self-defense, but it is Kim who lies to protect Edward from the police and the angry mob. She is, however, an imperfect hero who never confesses the truth about the burglary or Jim's death to anyone but her granddaughter. I mean, she could have in the intervening years, but I don't think that's likely. Understanding Kim helps me to finally feel at peace with the film. I see now that although the film is named after Edward, he is not the protagonist. Kim is the protagonist. The entire film is from her perspective. That is why she has an arc. That is why we get so much insight and why the character of Kim has so much emotional depth and understandable flaws. It is important to note that Edward Scissorhands is one of Burton's most personal projects. The screenplay was written by author and director Caroline Thompson on a story put forward by Burton. It was inspired by his childhood in Burbank, California, during a time when he felt isolated and socially awkward, unable to communicate with others or retain friendships. He based the character on a drawing he made as a teen of a thin man with long, sharp, blade-like fingers. He said about that time, "I get the feeling that people got this urge to want to leave me alone for some reason. I don't know exactly why." I originally had a lot more to say on this, and a lot of it very critical. I was ready to basically accuse Tim Burton of callously expecting women to change to suit the emotional needs of incels. My evidence was that by the end of the film, Edward doesn't change, but Kim does. And she changes specifically to fall in love with Edward. And the character of Jim is created just to be a bully and a Chad. I now realize that that is an extremely cynical and unkind view of the film. I decided against it because that's not how I feel anymore. I do not believe the film insists that changing to love what you feared is necessarily gendered or an example of emotional burdening. I think it bravely presents a feeling of hope. Hope that it is possible to attain emotional growth. Edward makes Kim realize how terrible Jim is, and then she feels empowered to break up with him. While she originally didn't want to be anywhere near Edward, she eventually finds safety and solace in him. I believe the film is making a statement about prejudice. At first, the neighbors don't know what to make of him, but they develop a superficial regard for him once he proves his usefulness as a hedge trimmer, dog groomer, and hairstylist. He becomes a local celebrity, although his fame never goes to his head, and he continues to show interest in possibly having the scissors removed and replaced with real hands. You see, his scissors may be part of him, but they are not important to him. He would gladly have normal hands if it meant greater quality of life, even if it meant an end to his fame. It is also important to note that through the entirety of the film, through his rise to fame, and even after the community turns on him, Peg never wavers in her loving support of Edward.
No matter what, Edward will always be special.
I think Peg is meant to personify acceptance and unconditional love. I said before that none of the characters but Kim has an arc. That includes Peg. She has no arc, but that's not a bad thing. She represents an ideal, angelic maternal figure and the glue that holds her family together. In the real world, I don't think it's healthy to show blind, unwavering support of others, but I do feel it's important to have an open heart and not see others purely for their usefulness. Peg can show us all how to be warm and accepting of people who are different. Seriously, I love Peg. She's a goddess. Like the other films I've reviewed on this channel, Edward Scissorhands should be viewed at different times in one's life. Its bright colors and storybook opening seems to advertise it as a family or a kid's film, but I didn't like it as a kid because it's not meant for kids. It's usually described as a fantasy or romance film, a drama, or even a holiday film. I only assumed it was a kid's film because I first saw it as a kid. Plus it has all those candy-colored houses. It's a film for anyone who has felt the pain of neighborhood gossip, unrequited love, dysfunctional relationships, the loss of a loving parent, and sexual harassment. For anyone who has endured the awkwardness of navigating social mores. I'm not saying children don't encounter these problems in real life, but they aren't usually portrayed in media created for them. Children aren't equipped to view them in media because they haven't developed the complex emotions related to coping with them. Therefore, I had trouble understanding any of these aspects of the film as a child, but as an adult, they hit excruciatingly close to home. This is why my mom liked it so much more than me. She first saw it as an adult and thought it was genius. I first saw it as a kid and thought it was weird. So how do I feel about it now? Honestly, I like it a lot now that I understand it. I would even venture to say that it's a great film, worthy of praise for its story structure and visual style. I don't know if I will ever like it more than his other films, as I can't ignore some of the plot holes. Analyzing this film was a journey of self-discovery. It's another example of why it's good to rewatch films and why media retrospectives are important. Lately, a lot of people have been looking back at the Twilight films and books for the opposite reason. It was something they liked as adolescents, but subsequent emotional growth has caused them to have more critical opinion. So what do you think of Edward Scissorhands? I know Edward is a kind of a goth icon, which makes sense, but what did you think of the film when you first saw it? Did you first see it as a child? If so, were you weirded out? Or did you easily empathize with the characters? Let me know in the comments. All I can think of during this scene when Edward gets drunk is,
Where's the rum gone?
Also, I'm pretty sure Sweeney Todd takes place in an evil mirror universe to Edward Scissorhands.
At last, my arm is completed.